So it's common knowledge that the human brain is exceptionally large, but it's less well appreciated that it's also exceptionally folded. Now, the reason why you'd want a more folded brain has to do with the anatomy of the brain. So the cell bodies of neurons, which are really the functional units of information processing in the brain, all lie in kind of a sheet on the outside of the cortex. It's called the cerebral cortex. It's the outside of the brain. So folding up the brain actually allows increased surface area in which to fit neurons, and this does it without inflating the overall head size, which is under some pretty intense constraints due to childbirth. So a more folded brain actually allows for a higher upper limit on cognition. Folds also are not randomly distributed across the cortex. Where they are is actually the result of natural selection for the most efficient information processing system in the brain. I'm going to help illustrate this with these pipe cleaners. So you can imagine that if two brain regions interact very regularly to complete tasks and exchange information, the most efficient system would be for them to have a lot of tracks physically connecting them. So I'm illustrating this by these pipe cleaners. These are the axon tracks, which allow different parts of the brain to communicate with one another. Two brain regions that need to interact less regularly are not going to need as many tracks physically connecting them, since they don't need to exchange as much information. This means that if natural selection is pushing for increased folding, the path of least resistance, quite literally in terms of mechanical tension, is to separate regions that are less connected, less functionally connected, than to try to separate regions that have a really thick barrier of this connective tissue, this so-called white matter. This means that by looking at where folds are on the outside of the brain, you can get an idea of the underlying information processing system that's going on. Taking it even further across different species, you can get an idea of how natural selection has been selecting for different cognitive processing strategies in different species based on their folding patterns. So in my PhD project, I was aiming to characterize the genetic basis of this trait. So I did some gene mapping studies. These basically allowed me to pinpoint particular regions of a chromosome, so these little genetic regions that affect differences in brain folding patterns. I can then look at how these gene regions have actually changed. So track the so-called molecular evolution, how these genes have changed on a molecular level to allow the different ranges of brain folding patterns that we see in modern primates. Thank you very much.